In previous lectures, we have discussed fast-acting ion channels. However, there are another type of receptors that are more complex and as a result a little slower, and these are called G-protein coupled receptors. Now we only have one new outcome for this lecture, and it's really to discuss how these G-protein coupled receptors or metabotropic receptors work. So another way to describe ligand-gated channels is ionotropic. These channels are fast-acting. It's essentially like putting a key into the keyhole, which ultimately allows a door to open. However, we have these metabotropic channels or G proteins. These channels are slow-acting. In this case, you put a key into the keyhole. This activates a multi-step process that ultimately results in a door opening up somewhere else, or the activation of an enzyme somewhere else. Okay, so kind of an easy way is it's like you put your key into the door, and then your next door neighbor's door is the one that actually unlocks. Kind of weird, but that's how these work. So a G protein is a three-part complex. There's alpha, beta, and gamma. If a molecule called GDP is attached to the G protein, it's considered inactive. However, if that GDP is replaced with GTP, the G protein is activated and then the magic happens. At its most basic, a G protein pathway is a three-step process. Step one is when a hormone binds to the G protein coupled receptor. This causes step two, which is when GDP leaves the G protein and is replaced by a GTP. To be clear, this is usually what happens. GDP leaves and GTP replaces it. However, sometimes that GDP is actually just converted to a GTP. And I want to make clear, GDP and GTP are very similar to ADP and ATP. The only difference is instead of having adenosine, we have something called guanosine. Now, once GTP is attached to the G protein, step three happens, which is GTP and alpha leave and bind to a protein. Now, when GTP and alpha bind to a protein, one of two things happens. The protein that GTP and alpha has bound to is an ion channel that will now open, or the protein that GTP and alpha has bound to is an enzyme which will now be activated that accelerates or makes it easier for a chemical reaction to occur. So these G protein pathways are important because they are involved in so much physiology. G proteins affect the strength of contraction of cardiac muscle, your vision, your smell, and a bunch of other things. I've got these three that are in bold because we're actually going to talk about those specific examples in those specific pathways later on in the semester. But for now, we're just leaving G protein pathways at that basic three-step process. So, are you able to do the following? Can you list the basic steps of how a G protein works? Can you explain the difference between a G protein coupled receptor and a typical ion channel? And can you identify the two main effects of an activated G protein?